Please note that the content of this podcast reflects the personal opinions and experiences of the speakers. It should not be considered medical advice. For professional guidance, consult with a relevant expert. SIA has no affiliation to any commercial entities spoken about or highlighted as part of the content of this podcast series. SIA is not in a position to endorse or recommend individual products or entities. Participants' views are based entirely on their own experiences and they are speaking as separate entities. So first things first, my name's Ollie and I'm going to be hosting this series. Thank you for joining us for our fifth and final pod in SIA's Travelling with Confidence. Hold back your tears, don't be too sad it's the last, because we've got a gem of a conversation to come. Today we're going to be talking about all things you. By that I mean looking after yourself and your equipment when you're travelling. Thinking back to when I was first starting travelling after a spinal cord injury, it was very easy to feel overwhelmed by all the new things I had to manage, alongside the fear of the unknown and what if scenarios. To be honest, as my wife tells me regularly, I can still get a bit grumpy before I travel because of that unknown and the what ifs. Today, we're going to be exploring the possible challenges and solutions in regard to looking after health and personal equipment when travelling far and wide. As you'd already know from listening to the other pods, you won't be just listening to my dulcet tones. I'm joined by three awesome guests who are bringing with them both their lived and professional experience. We will hear from someone who has some incredible travel stories since sustaining a spinal cord injury. We're really lucky to be joined by their partner to open up the conversation and gain insight into a different and important perspective, that of carers and loved ones. And we're also joined by an experienced healthcare professional to give us some advice on managing health concerns whilst travelling and tap into their experience in aviation medicine. So enough from me, and let's get started with the guest today. Mark, would you be able to give everyone a quick introduction, who you are, and your favourite place you've travelled to?
Yes, good morning. My name is Mark Jarrett. I'm a nurse by profession, and I've been a nurse for many, many years. I've worked out just January, I've been qualified as a nurse for 40 years. Previously, I worked at the National Spine Injury Centre at Stoke Mandeville Hospital for nearly 30 years. And in amongst that, I got involved in aviation medicine and started off bringing people from abroad back to the UK, back to the Spine Injury Centre, and then to the other Spine Injury Centre who got injured abroad. In the end, I did over 1,000 repatriations from abroad. And then 3 years ago, I joined the Spine Injuries Association as a clinical nurse specialist, and I provide clinical support and guidance to the London, Kent, East Sussex and Surrey area.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. And where's the favourite place you've travelled to?
New Zealand.
Amazing. Love it. And Lois, would you be able to give everyone a quick introduction, who you are and your favourite place you've travelled to?
Yeah, my name is Lois and my husband Ed is on this podcast as well, and Ed sustained a spinal cord in 2017. And so I've got lived experience of travelling with somebody with a spinal cord injury. I'm also the co-founder of our own charity, Millimetres to Mountains Foundation, and I'm a life and relationship coach. My favourite place I've travelled, and I absolutely love travelling, so it's really hard to pick. Italy, Ed and I got married in Tuscany, so that holds some really nice memories. But we have just got back from Mount Kenya with the charity, and that was an unbelievable place.
Amazing. Looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that shortly. Ed, would you be able to give everyone a quick introduction, who you are and your favourite place you've travelled to?
Yeah, hi guys. I'm Ed, Lois's lesser half, and I was a professional rugby player for 10 years. Sustained an accident, as Lois said, in 2017. Spinal cord injury diving into shallow water. For those medics out there, C6, C7, fracture dislocation. And it turned out to be an incomplete injury. Originally was diagnosed as complete, but turned out to be incomplete. As part of that journey, for some reason, post-spinal cord injury, I got into mountaineering the wrong way round, but I started walking up hills and then they got higher and we went further, and now I'm doing stuff all over the world and I'm an ambassador for various brands and things like that. But most importantly, run our charity with Lois, helping other people get access to the outdoors despite some physical limitations sometimes, but following trauma in general, but also helping them get back on their feet in any walk of life. So that's the passion project. And favourite place I've been, again, that's really tough. Obviously, I've got to say Italy, but we got married there. So Italy aside, I would say Nepal holds a very special place in my heart. I've been fortunate enough to go 6 times now. An amazing country, mind-blowing mountains and scenery, but most importantly, incredible, incredible people.
I went to Nepal pre-injury, and I can't quite imagine navigating Nepal post-injury.
Not somewhere for a wheelchair, really. It's,
No.
I mean, there's not a lot of tarmac or lifts, etc. I mean, we actually support a spinal injury hospital over there through the charity, and it's incredible how resourceful they are. But, you know, as you can imagine, it's very difficult if you sustain a spinal cord injury in a country like that, especially. It's definitely not the flattest country in the world. In fact, it might be the most mountainous country in the world, but there's not the modern resources around to look after people. However, they're so resilient. They're amazing people. For example, one of the guys who was discharged from the hospital, his brother and his cousin carried him for 4 days in his wheelchair back to the village.
Wow.
So it puts into context the kind of challenges that they have to face.
Yeah, slightly different perspective, isn't it? So when you were in Mount Kenya recently, were you summiting the mountain?
Yeah, we did Mount Kenya. So we had 20 people, a mixture of fundraisers and beneficiaries. We had actually a lovely lady who had a spinal cord injury about 5 years ago, and another beneficiary who was deaf-blind. Summit Mount Kenya, which was so emotional, obviously. Again, a bit like Nepal, the people were just incredible. Like, we could not have got up that mountain without the porters and the guides, the cooks that looked after us. So yeah, a proper team experience, all getting to the top of that summit.
And when you're, I suppose, looking at putting one of those trips together, I'm just thinking, you know, when I'm traveling to places, about how I manage bladder and bowel and things like that when I'm away. And I can't think there's many toilets around, and kind of the challenges around bladder and things like that. How do you go about planning that for a group trip? I suppose first off, be interested to hear, Lois, and then maybe that personal experience from you, Ed, if you don't mind.
Ed can talk about his experiences of managing that equipment, but in terms of for the group, we make sure there's a hell of a kit list, and then have one-on-one calls with each of the beneficiaries to kind of chat through what to expect. For Caroline, who was the deaf-blind climber, she had a one-on-one sighted guide, so we make sure that we've got just enough people supporting from that side. I think Ed's just got very used to it. Being in nature is actually quite good for you, Ed, isn't it? Because you can pee freely.
Yeah. My issues are walking around London, you know, where's the nearest toilet, and are they going to let you go and use it unless you're buying a coffee? The amount of bottles of water I've bought just so I can use a toilet, which shouldn't really be a limitation, but it seems to be. Obviously, when you're out and about in the mountains and in nature, peeing's a bit easier. My bladder and bowel is affected. I use a Convene catheter, so I have a bag on at all times. For me, managing that, it's more about how do I access that bag, and that becomes around kit adaptations, extra zips in my trousers, because you don't want to have to pull your trousers down to empty your catheter bag when you're at, well, A, if it's really cold and you're up a mountain, or B, you know, if you're just walking around a park in wherever it might be and there might be a lot of people around, you know, just that anxiety around having to do something that might seem unnatural to the general population can sometimes put people off from even going to those places in the first place. So trying to make that as discreet for people as possible. I've got pretty used to it, you know, in terms of how I manage my bladder and bowel in those situations, but it's definitely a learning curve. And of course, everyone's situation is different. That's what Lois was saying. We work closely with our beneficiaries to make sure that A, it's the right trip for them, because we have everything from accessible walks in the UK for wheelchair users up to climbing things like Mount Kenya. So there's a variety of trips. So we won't take someone somewhere that it's going to be really uncomfortable or unmanageable for them. But then also we'll use our experience, but also the peers' experience and healthcare professionals' experience to make sure that person has A, got all the right equipment, but has B, got all the support they need when they're there. And then it's kind of a learning on the job thing. You want to encourage people to not let these changes, if it's an acquired disability or complications that they may live with that might be awkward in other countries but okay at home, to be a barrier for them doing it in the first place. Often there are ways around it. You just have to think outside the box sometimes.
It's so true. And even thinking outside the box, like you say, when you're in London, can be, like you say, the biggest challenge. And I think it's probably slightly easier for me being a wheelchair user. It's that obvious physical disability, being able to go into a Starbucks and looks with a slightly worried face on and say, I need to use your toilet now. They'll usually let me in straight away. But I know others have a very different experience going in with a hidden disability.
That's a really important point, because a lot of disabilities aren't visible, and people will have bladder and bowel issues and be walking around completely normally. I mean, I don't walk around normally. I look like I'm very drunk actually when I'm walking around. So often I'll get some disturbed looks like, why is this drunk guy coming into our coffee shop at 10 a.m? But then they'll see the foot splint, they'll see it's a repetitive movement, and normally they'll be pretty amenable. But it's a very important point because we've got beneficiaries that have underlying health situations because of their injuries or because of their situation that aren't visible. That's an education piece that is a long way, that needs a lot of work for the general public, but it can be harder for them to put their hand up and explain themselves. As you said, if you roll in a wheelchair, it's pretty self-explanatory that you need to go to the toilet and no one's going to get in your way.
The mountains and some of the trips that I know you guys have been on, pretty inhospitable, for summiting mountains and really testing yourself and really kind of pushing yourself outside your comfort zone. And you said you've become a mountaineer since a spinal cord injury. What was it that drove you to look and hunt for those experiences?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's evolved, but I was very active my whole life. I played rugby and, I didn't really appreciate it at the time, but I was outside every day, all day, every day. That was my job. And obviously, all of a sudden, you're in hospital for 4 or 5 months and you really start to feel the effects of not just being able to be mobile, but actually just not being outside and getting that fresh air and sun on your face. And after I left hospital, after about 7 months, I was struggling a bit at home, actually. I think you go through a second wave often when you leave hospital. That's our experience with, I don't know about yourself, but with a lot of the beneficiaries as well, I know I did, of like, okay, in hospital, you're in a bit of a bubble. It's set up for someone with mobility issues or health conditions, and you're surrounded by other people like that as well. But then you go home, and all of a sudden, you've got that direct comparison of what you used to be able to do in the house and now what you can't do. Everyone else goes back to their everyday jobs. And I was really struggling with motivation to keep doing the rehab, to keep pushing, to see what sort of recovery I could make, that acceptance piece, the whole identity crisis around being a rugby player. Then all of a sudden, what does the rest of my life look like? So I wanted to set myself a challenge to motivate me to keep going. And for me, it seemed like Snowdon seemed like a good choice because I'd been up there before. I didn't actually expect to get to the top. I just knew that if people saw me on my feet, then it might be able to offer some hope or inspiration that maybe the diagnosis they'd be given isn't necessarily the rule that they have to follow. Like, obviously, the caveat to that is if I had a complete injury, there's nothing I could have done. It doesn't matter how hard I would have worked, I wouldn't be back on my feet. But I needed the challenge to motivate myself to keep going. Plus, if it could inspire anyone else to give it a go or to get outdoors, then great. And then obviously we got up Snowdon, which I didn't actually expect to do. And I just felt this complete sense of like achievement, but also purpose, that I'd done something. I'd felt like a burden up until that point on everyone. And now I was surrounded by people who were saying, oh, that's amazing. Like, I'm taking something from your journey, the same way I'd taken things from other people's journeys. And then I was like, well, let's see if we can go higher. So the next year I found myself in the Alps, and the year after that I found myself in the Himalayas. And I realized how fortunate I am to be in a position to wobble up these mountains. I say I'm a mountaineer in inverted commas. Obviously, I'm still not very good at it, but everyone's Everest is different. But for me, it's more about the headspace it gives and the opportunity to challenge myself, set goals. And it's more interesting for me than just going to the gym and just like grinding through rehab. If there's a purpose in mind, there's a goal set, I just make it public and start fundraising, then I don't have a choice. So then it motivates the next 6 months of rehab. So it's worked for me, and that's why we set up the charity. I thought if it works for me, being outside, how it's supported me physically and emotionally, then it should work for others. And we found that it really has.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for sharing that. And Lois, coming to you as a loved one, seeing your partner go through something as traumatic as a spinal cord injury and then transition into home. And I remember feeling completely overwhelmed, that transition into home. And Ed, as you said, the real difficulties and realities like really hitting home at that point. And then all of a sudden, Ed saying, I want to walk up a mountain. How does that make you feel? Because you're obviously seeing a lot of the other things around managing health needs on the outside.
Yeah, it was a massive adjustment when we went back to normal life out of hospital. And you do have a bit of a sense of wanting to wrap your loved one up in cotton wool. But I think personality-wise, ambition-wise, we're both quite similar. I didn't ever want to stop him from pursuing his dreams, and that was mountains. Luckily, I did love the outdoors as well, so I could take part in those adventures. There's definitely something about watching him stumble up a mountain, which I find really, really quite difficult. And I think even physios and other friends find it hard as well, because Ed does look like he's going to fall at every step. So at the beginning, you're finding this balance of when do you intervene? When do you help? When do you become fussy? Because that's one thing that I learned really quickly, was that Ed did not like to be fussed over. I mean, sometimes to the point where I actually think I look quite rude. Like, if he does actually fall over in front of me, I don't even really try and pick him up. I don't make a big scene. I just let him get on with it, or actually just start laughing, which doesn't go down that well with others. But I know that that's what he wants. He would rather us just make light of the situation rather than it being a big hoo-ha. But at the very beginning, you were learning this as you go on. You didn't know what was right or wrong, and that communication between both of us really took some learning on how we were going to tackle this going forward. I think we've got a pretty good balance now. It works pretty well, and Ed's luckily managed to find this balance of risky and not reckless, which I'm very grateful about, because the mountains were getting higher and higher. And on the last one in Nepal, he did nearly die again. So I think he's realised that he's got so much to live for, and that you can push yourself and take some risks, but you do need to manage them very well and know what you're capable of. Have an amazing support team around you, which Ed will admit he has had on all of his mountain trips. He's not going into this alone in experience. So luckily we have struck that balance now.
You touched on communication there being so key, I think, between loved ones. It's so important, and often so difficult as well, because everything can feel quite raw, and some of those things you have to talk about are quite sensitive, and people coming from very different perspectives on the scale. So building that communication is so important. And Ed, I just wanted to kind of ask, do you have any dramas with skin?
I do, not in the typical pressure sore sense. So I've got no pain or temperature sensation down the right hand side of my body. So I've got something called Brown-Séquard syndrome. So my left side doesn't function well physically or motor wise, but has good sensation. And it's the opposite on the other side. I've got good motor function on the right, but no sensation. So things like blisters, you don't feel them evolving. And I've rubbed some pretty big holes in my feet before, which of course, if you're on a longer expedition, can get infected. So constantly having to check your body, especially the areas that you can't feel pain in, is a really important part of those longer trips. And it's played into the types of AFO I wear and stuff like that, because I do move awkwardly, but I move quite a lot, obviously, with the things that I do. There's that opportunity for abrasion at all points. So having an AFO, for example, that's external to my shoe is really important for me, because the internal ones I've caused rubbing in the past. And temperature's another issue. I've leant against hot surfaces before and not known it until I've smelt burning flesh. So you just you learn these lessons the hard way, and you start to become more attuned to it. And over the years, you just get better at it. But obviously you've always got to keep an eye out.
It's something I'm always nervous of. When I was first injured, I was in an induced coma for about a month. And within that, I developed 2 pressure sores. So I woke up to the fun of being on bed rest for 6 months straight away. And it's something I always think about when I'm away traveling. And I now travel with a Vicare cushion, which I think is really, really helpful for me as I'm transferring around all the time. And I suppose at that point, wanted to kind of come to Mark from that medical advice point of skin and managing skin on the go.
Skins are, as we all know, is a big issue. A lot of people don't realise that the issues aren't just lack of movement, lack of sensation. There are physiological changes within paralysed skin that makes the skin much more vulnerable to pressure ulcers and moisture associated damage, and makes it harder and longer to heal than would ordinary skin. So Ed's sounds extraordinarily good at looking after his skin and keeping an eye on it. Things like flying can be a tricky one. Aircraft seats aren't terribly good for pressure relief. Some airlines and cabin crew it's a controversial subject, can be funny about you using your own cushion on the seat. Some don't seem to care or don't mind, but there are thoughts that if you put a cushion on an aircraft seat, it alters the position and shape of the seat. And if there's an instance, whether the seat and the seatbelt will perform the same as it should do. So some cabin crews will refuse to let you use your own cushion. So you might have to do more pressure relief than perhaps you would want to. The other thing is anything airfield on an aircraft altitude will expand by about a third of its volume. If you've got any cushions that have got air in them, you may have to readjust them after you get up into the cruise. That's always a common one, because they'll tend to be overinflated if you're not careful.
I got caught out with that and had a very saggy cushion by the time I landed with an air-filled one. And I've never actually had a problem with taking a cushion on board. I think that's something I always live by when I'm traveling as a wheelchair user. You have to go through that real anxious point of being separated from my chair, but I'll always make sure I take my cushion with me at all times, just because I have that fear both on the plane of the pressure relieving element, but also if my chair doesn't turn up at the other end and I'm on an airport chair for a couple of days, I want to make sure I have that pressure relieving cushion. So really, really important, I think, to always take your cushion with you at all times. And I'm sure you come across that, Lois, with some of the people that you've travelled with.
Yeah, the beneficiaries do vary in their traumas. We've got a few people that have got spinal cord injuries, and I think one of which, actually, she had the metal break in her spine, which is very rare, when she was over in Costa Rica, and so couldn't fly back, had to have another surgery, and then I think eventually she did have somebody come with her, which I'd love to know a bit more from Mark, like how that was organised and dealing with insurance. And also she couldn't get hold of any catheters. She'd only taken enough for that amount of time, and so trying to get the catheter that she needed in Costa Rica through insurance, I mean, you can just imagine the admin that was involved in that. So yeah, and then I believe she had to have a medical assistance the whole way home to think about things like the cushion for her and everything like that. So yeah, it's an absolute minefield when something like that happens.
Absolutely. Travel insurance is desperately important because you've got no idea how expensive medical care is some places, and repatriation is incredibly expensive. I've had families remortgaged in their house when they paid off their mortgage to bring relatives home. It's enormously expensive. Getting medical supplies in some countries is extraordinarily difficult. I know Coloplast, I think, will courier stuff out to other countries if you're one of their customers. I don't know about the other medical supplies, but generally it can be got, but some of the obscure countries it's tricky. Repatriation is tricky and can be very dangerous. The aviation environment is tricky, and there's a huge desire when something happens abroad is people want to come home, which is a perfectly understandable desire. Because the aviation environment's not great for us, it can be very dangerous. We try and instill a lot of patience. If the medical care is okay where they are, we'll try and leave them longer till they're really fit to fly in the aviation environment. That's always a tricky conversation.
Wow, so the big thing is make sure you're traveling with health insurance, right? So you're not kind of caught out. Ed, Lois, do you have any kind of advice on insurance kind of companies you've used before? Because I think traveling with a disability can be a bit tricky, right?
We haven't had too much problem, and obviously we are trying to get people with spinal cord injuries up mountains. So there are a couple of good insurance brokers out there that we've found. I think the only problem with us is that when you get over 5,000 metres, they really don't like it. We had one incident with one of the beneficiaries who was trying to do Himlong Hamal with Ed, and there was just a slight change in his medication within 6 months of him departing. He was very stable with his spinal cord injuries, walking quadriplegic like Ed, but had changed his pain meds within the last 6 months, and the insurance flagged that as a change, so therefore weren't going to insure him going forward, even though nothing physically had changed within him. So that's definitely something to look out for, because that was an absolute battle with the insurance company to try and get that through. The BMC have actually been probably the most stable for us with doing really outdoorsy trips. You can pay a membership and then they cover the top insurance, which Ed did actually have to use in Nepal once. So yeah, and they were amazing.
Getting rescued off the side of a mountain in the Himalayas by a helicopter is not cheap. Luckily, I was insured properly. I think it's a good point that Lois made is there are good insurance companies out there, but it's always worth understanding completely what the intricacies of that insurance contract is. Because for me, I was surprised now that when I go to get insurance, even if I'm climbing to 6,000-7,000 meters, I'm not viewed any different to someone who doesn't have a disability, because I'm not actively going to the hospital. I haven't had any procedures in the last 3 years, and my medication hasn't changed in the last 3 years. So then I've got a spinal cord injury, I'm walking quadriplegic, and I'm going to climb a mountain in the Himalayas. They're like, well, computer says that's fine. I'm like, okay, fine, sweet. But if I did change my medication or something like that came up, I would have to be conscious of thinking ahead that, okay, how is that going to affect my insurance moving down the line? It might even be worth speaking to them beforehand if you've got a trip in the diary for later on in the year or the next year. So that you know what insurance companies are like. They're always trying to find a way not to pay, so you can't give them any loophole to get to that point.
Yeah, really, really good advice. Really good advice. And I suppose just thinking about like daily routines and things like that. So I can struggle a little bit with spasms. So I've got a baclofen pump. I kind of always have to stretch and make sure I've kind of at least laid straight or try and stand up and things like that. Otherwise they can get a bit lively and be a bit frustrating. And sitting on a plane, traveling, and kind of all of the unknowns, right, when you're abroad, kind of I sometimes have to just force it in or be willing to accept that it's going to be a bit uncomfortable for a bit of time. Ed, I don't know if you've got any experience of managing routines, I suppose, like health routines when you're abroad and traveling.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, similar in the set, I don't use a baclofen pump, but I do have tone and spasms that are linked to, you know, how active I've been the day before. Normally, quality of sleep is a big one for me. If I've had a poor night's sleep or I'm tired, then my tone and spasms go up. And every morning, there's a routine to try and get moving. You know, when I first get out of bed, I'm doubled over and almost crawling to the bathroom. And then it's kind of like the evolution of man over the course of the first hour. Like eventually I'll get standing up in front of the kettle. But there's a process to go through. And also I find it really important to make sure I'm religious with those stretching routines, even if I am feeling okay, because the danger is you feel all right and you forget these routines. Then all of a sudden it comes back and bites you in the backside because they're not front and center if you're not immediately tight, had a bad night's sleep because of spasms. It's making them habitual. So every morning, this is the routine you go through before you get in the shower, before you have a cup of tea, and then eventually it becomes subconscious. When you're traveling, it can be more difficult because those routines are more ingrained when you're at home. If you're out and about and moving around and going to different countries or different hotels, or of course on these big hikes or climbing, you might be sleeping in a tent, which is not ideal for someone who struggles with sleep anyway. So you might have to spend more time doing the stretching, doing the movement. But I often find that if I teleported myself to waking up in the way I felt in a tent on like day 4 or day 5 in the Himalayas, I would think I was dying. But through experience, you realize that actually, if you go through the routines, you get moving, it might be uncomfortable to start with. It will be okay eventually, you know, fast forward a couple of hours. And for me, because everyone's different, I'm walking again. So experience is a big one as well. Understanding your own body, how it's affected by altitude is another, you know, that's a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down because that affects everyone's body differently. But obviously when you have neurological issues, it affects people in different ways. The cold is a big one for me because I have limited function in my hands anyway, so they get cold and they stop working. So equipment changes when you travel or if you're going to these environments, because you've got to manage yourself in different ways given not just the country you're in, but like the environment. So the temperature, the height, the humidity, all of those things of different countries. You've got to think ahead a bit of like, okay, I'm going somewhere that's really hot and humid. I overheat easily because I don't sweat from below the chest. What else am I going to need to take with me? I'm going to make sure I've got extra water on me at all times. So those routines you've got instilled at home might not necessarily be the routines that are as effective in different countries.
Building up that repertoire, that toolkit of experience, right, like you say, is so vitally important. And there is a lot to be learned when you are at home. You don't have to be travelling to the absolute extremes, right? Travelling into London or going on walks and hikes and even long car journeys in the UK can make a massive difference with that kind of experience toolkit. I've certainly been caught out just with tone and spasms increasing, but also managing bladder on long car journeys can be a bit of a nightmare. Trying to find places to go to the toilet or even resorting to pulling over on the side of the road and having a catheter out the side of the car. And that actually opened my eyes to the different types of catheters out there. So maybe even one with a bag on that can give you way more options in those different scenarios. And I use an intermittent self-catheterization, but I also have a convener and leg bag just as a backup, just in case, because I've changed too many outfits in the initial stage of the spinal cord injury to want to avoid that at all costs. I suppose from an incomplete point of view, Ed, do you have any bits of kit or anything like that you've found like help you?
Do you know what? My convene catheters, sometimes I've got to wear the leg bag, and obviously I've always got to be conscious of where the bathroom is. I do have sensation, so I know when I need to go, but I can't hold it for very long at all. I've got like a minute or two between the sensation coming and needing to relieve myself. So in a car, like you said, I mean, I've done a full tour of all of the UK service stations. I know where all the toilets are in each of them. I'm often having to stop a few times on the same trip. But if it's a really long drive, sometimes I'll attach a night bag to my Convene, so like a 2 litre bag, so that I don't have to stop so regularly. And again, you know, pulling over and being able to find somewhere where you can empty the bag out of the side of the car, that can be useful. In fact, sometimes it comes in handy. You know, it's actually really useful if you're up a mountain in a tent, because most people who don't have Convenes on have to kneel up in a tent in the middle of the night and try and pee into a Nalgene bottle, which often doesn't all go in the Nalgene bottle. And I can just lie there, and it basically acts as a hot water bottle at the bottom of your sleeping bag.
Yeah.
So I think there's a few of my mountaineering friends who don't have disabilities looking at these
Slightly
Convenes
jealous.
thinking, hang on, this could be quite useful for me as well. I mean, I think bladder and bowel to a certain extent is probably the thing that is on my mind more than anything else to do with my disability from a day-to-day basis, wherever I might be, and learning to manage that. And there are the inevitable accidents that will happen and still happen. You get equipment malfunctions and all of those sorts of things. And actually, I've changed brands a couple of times, and now I find, because I thought it was my fault for overfilling, but some might work for you, some might not, and you might have a high leg bag or a low leg bag, and it's worth, if you are having more accidents, just playing around with it and changing it. There's a lot of different options out there, and finding the one that's right for you so that you can be more comfortable and more confident to get out there and do the things you want to do is really important.
Yeah, definitely. And a bit of advice on the 2 litre leg bag is something I use on the plane. So I'll just rig it up at the bottom and have it into a rucksack, so it can be really discreet. I'm conscious both Ed and I are blokes. Lois, do you have any perspective from the female side from some of the people that you work with?
So Charlotte, who was talking about with the Costa Rica trip, so she uses intermittent catheters. And one thing that we found was really challenging, I mean, Ed mentioned about it's not ideal to be putting your trousers down at the side of a mountain, which, by the way, is what girls have to do anyway. Berghaus have actually been working with our charity to adapt pieces of clothing, and they have adapted her mountaineering trousers so that the zip comes all the way down at the front so that she can effectively pee standing up, which is unbelievable because that was so difficult for her. Like, if you're up a UK mountain or just even in the hills, you know, you're trying to find a good place to go and squat down and try and do that, and like mark medically risk of infection when you're out and about as well, not the best.
But
so
also, sorry
clearer.
Lois, she also can't hold a squat for a long time,
Yeah.
because of her weaknesses. So it's obviously such a simple adaptation to extend the zip further down and round the crotch, and now it's made a huge difference for her. But I obviously, like you rightfully pointed out, blokes are lucky in that respect, especially when it comes to Convenes, because you've got 2 parts of a hose pipe to fit it on with. It's like purpose built, but a lot more difficult for women for sure.
Mark, do you have anything to add?
Particularly with people who use intermittent self-catheterization. Often people forget that there's no reason why they can't put an indwelling catheter in with a bag for, particularly flying, where there's just, as you know better than I do, how accessible are aircraft toilets to get into. There's nothing wrong with a few days if you're going up a mountain to use a indwelling catheter rather than trying to do intermittent self-catheterization. You've got slight increases in infection rate with an indwelling than as opposed to an intermittent, but for very short periods like that, so the increase in risk of infection is very minor, really, for the added convenience.
I actually use an indwelling for every single long haul flight I use, just because I'm trying to minimize that risk of accidents and make it a little bit easier to manage.
Yeah, it's also that constant anxiety that sits with it. You can just relax a lot more, which makes such a difference. You might not wet yourself, but just thinking about the chance of doing it for 12 hours on a plane is not a nice experience.
No, it's not at all. Talking about bladder, but also that the bowel aspect of long haul flights can be pretty challenging when you've got changeovers at times of the day that wouldn't necessarily be your usual time to go to the toilet, and also tight changeovers. And I always try and plan those changeovers to be maybe a couple of hours longer than they would have been pre-injury, just to give me that option to go to the bathroom. But it removes that anxiety, like you said, Ed. I think like that, you're going away to enjoy yourself. You don't want to be on tenterhooks the whole time you're traveling.
I used to be very guilty of turning up 2 minutes before departure in terms of like trains or planes. And I remember the turning point, actually. I turned up at Bath train station and cut it a bit fine. And this was sort of 2 years after my accident. So I'm still pretty unstable. I am now, but I had 2 poles and I heard the beeping of the train doors as I got onto the platform and they sort of were about to shut. And I almost forgot that my situation. So I went to, I was like, oh, just take a couple of steps, jog onto the train. Of course, took 1 step and fell flat on my face and the doors shut in front of me. And then you can see the people sat on the train just looking at me and I'm looking up at them. And I'm, ever since that day, I haven't missed a train. I've been a lot more organised, got there a lot earlier, and mostly to just remove that anxiety. Lois takes the mickey out of me a little bit because airports and things where I used to be very laid back and I'm like, no, we've got to be there 2.5 hours before. Let's just sit and have a coffee there rather than having a coffee at home. And Lois still loves to cut it fine. So that's where we butt heads a little bit.
We're both learning with that one. And I think that is one of the biggest learnings with travel is having to plan ahead. I think spontaneity goes out the window a little bit. You've got to be organised. We do all of our packing way earlier than we would before in case, we've been stuck before when we've been packing on the day and Ed's realised that he hasn't got enough Convene catheters, and so we're trying to ring the pharmacy and get an emergency delivery of those, so again, you learn from that experience. So you do it earlier, you make a list, you start planning ahead, which I think when you first start doing that, you are a bit frustrated, but then it is all about that reducing anxiety. If you can just make yourself feel more comfortable, and then the more you do it, the more you get used to it, to the point that now Ed and I are out of the country probably once a month, aren't we? And it doesn't feel stressful anymore, which is a really, really nice place to be in.
But you will forget stuff. Like, that's just being human. And I think one thing that's been quite useful for me is finding an equivalent or something that works. It might not be quite as good as the thing you're used to that you can access quickly. So whether that's through Amazon or a next day delivery that doesn't necessarily have to take prescription pharmacy. So if you are packing and we're all human and you go, oh no, I haven't got enough for the 2 weeks we're away, have you got that quick option to mean that you don't have to delay the trip or something like that as well?
And it's amazing how helpful Google Translate is in those situations, right? Of typing in weird and wonderful medical products to Google Translate. And I've also, I've actually been away and had an indwelling in, and I travelled without a spare. Now I always travel with a spare, but had a problem with that indwelling. The little balloon inside it popped, just came out with no rhyme or reason. And went down to the local medical centre, took about an hour and a half to actually explain what the problem was, because that was the biggest thing. And then as soon as we kind of got through that translation issue, they gave me a new one and sent me on my way with a spare at this point in time. So I think, like you say, there's always a solution that you can find, and know that there's that kindness of strangers aspect is so important in all travel. I don't know if you've got any other experiences of maybe things going slightly awry and then bringing them back into the direction you want to be going, Ed.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's happened quite a few times. Losing things like so you might have 3 pieces of luggage with you. If you've put all your medical equipment in one bag and it doesn't turn up at the other end, you can be in a bit of trouble there. So I always make sure there's extras spread across all of my kit just to make sure that I've got a buffer at the other end if a bag doesn't turn up. That's happened in the past. There's various examples, but I completely agree with you. The kindness of strangers is always useful when traveling. And I think, that communication piece that Lois was talking about, everyone's different in terms of how they like to be interacted with. And I think Lois said, yes, I am, I do like to try and do as much of it as I can myself. However, over time, I was probably quite stubborn at the beginning. I realized that, you come into this, Lois and I have been together a long time. So with your partner, it becomes almost subconscious. There's things that Lois can obviously do more efficiently and quicker than me. And there's things that I'm perfectly good at doing as well. So the house chores, for example, get devised in that way without things being mentioned, or Lois will pick the suitcase up and take it down the stairs sort of thing, without me getting funny about it and then ending up in a heap at the bottom with a suitcase on top of me. So there's got to be some realism and modesty involved there. But also, if you're interacting with someone from the point of wanting to help them, if you see someone struggling, I think it's always best to ask if they want help rather than just try and do something for them. And I will never get annoyed at someone if the intent is right. And I know people have different interpretations of that, like how dare they try and help me, I'm perfectly capable. But if someone's coming at you with goodwill, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and you can politely decline. Or I've got better at accepting support, because sometimes you might be able to do it yourself, but someone's trying to do something good and you can make them feel awkward by just telling them to leave you alone. Sometimes just going, yes, thank you very much for helping me take my bag there, I really appreciate it, doesn't go amiss.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also how disability is viewed in different cultures is so different. So actually, when we do travel, we have to take into account like the different cultures and the way people may or may not approach the conversation and offer support. And I think especially in the context of looking after yourself and maybe needing support, that can be challenging, right? How do you navigate that?
In Kenya, I had a lot of people praying for me. They would, to the point one person would come up, put their hand on my head and was sort of chanting. That did get a little bit frustrating, but I'm quite I'm a very amenable person, so I let it happen. But I would not advise going and praying for someone and putting your hand on their head, because that for me is implying that you don't want to be in the situation you're in. Now, it's very different helping with something practically, but saying you feel really sorry for someone, or like the pity element, is not an angle to go down, because I'm probably happier now than I was before I had my accident. So making an assumption in that guise isn't the right way. We're a lot better in the UK, and some of the Paralympics has obviously been a big part of that. That's really helped that movement, that just because you've got a disability doesn't mean you're more vulnerable in certain respects, or you need more help, or you should be felt sorry for, because there's plenty of people with disabilities who are perfectly happy. In fact, the majority of us are, and more capable than people without disabilities in a lot of cases too. But in other cultures, it is just seen as something, especially if it's a culture where most of the workforce is to do with physical labor. There, take Nepal, for example, the disabled community is probably seen as they can't work anymore. They might be another mouth to move, there might be a hindrance or whatever it might be, and they are looked at in a very different way. Not necessarily in a derogatory way the whole time, but it's like it is something to feel sorry for. But over here it's not. So it's keeping that in mind as well when you do go to these other cultures, that something that might seem a bit over the top or insulting here, it's not necessarily because they're meaning it that way. It's just the way that their culture is.
It's a really, really good bit of advice, and something to be very conscious of, and maybe even to take a little bit of time to research a little bit of those perspectives before you go. And I think research doesn't have to be, just reading books and all of those kind of things. It's speaking to people. I think that's so important, and having those networks and communities. And just on that point, are there any apps when you're looking at the broader spectrum of traveling that you've used successfully, like working with the people you work with, Lewis?
I'm just trying to think about abroad. Not necessarily. I think the one that comes to mind is we've been doing the Southwest Coast Path for the last 4 years with the charity, and they are getting better and better at outlining sections of it that are wheelchair accessible. That has been really helpful. I mean, we did do one year that the council said it was fully wheelchair accessible, but after doing it you realise it's not and that has very different meanings, especially with locked gates for farmers which are meant to be open, and badly designed access. But they are getting better and better, and I think there are a lot of communities out there trying to photograph and video accessible routes, which is a really good initiative that we're trying to do more of with the charity as well.
Yeah, with access to information now as well, there's some really good blogs that I've read in the past, and I'll often just Google, or other search engines are available, just managing Kathmandu in a wheelchair. More often than not, almost everywhere, someone will have written a diary or some feedback or some information about what it's like in that country, or advising on different places to go. Obviously, the further afield you go, the less populated that information is. But if you're going to European countries, for example, there's a lot of information out there on the internet, if you spend a bit of time reading through it, that can help, and also advise where is accessible. There's a lot of places that are set up for, whether it be hotels or, as Lois said, hiking routes, things like that will give you a bit of intel. But there's nothing better than personal insight. So if someone's written something about it, sometimes they'll put their contact details there. You could drop them an email, because sometimes there's a disconnect between what officially is described as accessible and what is the reality of that situation.
Accessible means very different things to different people, right?
Yeah.
And it's all very dependent on their own disabilities or injuries. And Mark, just kind of coming to you, is there any kind of apps or bits of resource and stuff like that that you'd recommend people to check out?
FCO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office website, is really good. There's a page we used to use quite a lot is medications. There's lots and lots of countries that certain medications are completely illegal and you will go to prison for carrying them, but they're perfectly normal prescription drugs in the UK. Codeine is one. And even transiting through places like United Arab Emirates. There's a page on the FCO website that so it shows you what you can carry through certain countries. While on that subject, it sometimes can be useful if you have a letter from your GP specifying what medications you have and what they're for. Sometimes they get picked up by security when you go through your X-ray with your hand luggage. And what's this? So if you've got a letter, that's often pacifies them that it's perfectly normal to carry. And on that subject, make sure your medication's in your hand luggage and not your check-in luggage.
Yeah, good advice. I get some very funny looks when they pat me down and they feel something underneath my t-shirt and lift it up and they've got my baclofen pump. And I've been taken into quite a few side rooms in countries like the UAE or India and places like that where they have been quite concerned. I'll put it that way. It has taken me a while to get through customs and things like that.
I can imagine, and perhaps if you're carrying a letter from the consultant specifying what it is, might just smooth your passage through. The other thing I was thinking about is the more you talk to airlines, the better and prepared they are. Cabin crew particularly and crew at the check-in desks, they don't like to be surprised with something unusual they aren't expecting, and they can have a wobbly on occasions. I've had that many times. Most airlines have what's called a PNR system, so when you talk about your needs, it'll go down on their computer system, and as soon as you go to the check-in desk, that will pop up on their screen immediately and on the screen of the cabin crew when you enter the aircraft, so they know exactly who you are, what your needs are. Just to say that some of the cheaper airlines, like EasyJet, Ryanair, don't have that system. So we've been caught out a few times with patients just going onto the aircraft and cabin crew having a bit of wobbly because it's something they weren't expecting. And so that's always a good tip. The more, if you talk to the airlines, particularly the more, the national ones, the smoother your passage can be.
Yeah, it comes back to Lois's point on communication, right? It's so important in all areas.
At Bristol Airport these days, I have to go in the side room every single time I fly through, which is like every month, because they've got the new scanners where it's not a metal detector, or you just, you stand like this, and even though my bag's empty, there's still residue of liquid in there. If I've gone to the toilet and emptied it, and even the staff there know me now, and they're like, I'm really sorry, we're just gonna have to do it again. So you just got to go and go, here we go. Yeah, nice to see you, Dave. Go in there, drop your trousers. Yeah, all good. Yeah, and then carry on through. That is quite frustrating. I mean, I don't really know the workaround. I'm all about airport security. Obviously, the scanners aren't missing a trick, but it does seem a bit unreasonable that because I have this medical condition, I have to go into a side room and pull my trousers down every single time I fly. What is the workaround there? I don't know.
That's a very tricky one.
There is a lot of work being done on air travel, specifically around, yes, the security, but also how do you get on and off planes, move around planes. There's a lot of energy going into it, isn't it? It's a complicated, challenging area because of loads of different reasons. More needs to be done. There needs to be energy kept on it. Mark, we've talked a fair bit around indwelling catheters and different types of catheters. Where would people go to work out how to put one in themselves when they've recently come out of hospital and haven't got that experience yet?
Hopefully, if they've been through a spinal cord injury centre, they would learn that while they're there. But as we know from our statistics, about 80% of people don't go to a spinal cord injury centre. So there's the clinicians at the Spinal Injuries Association. We can help with that. Your local incontinence service should be able to help with that. And quite often people are under a urology consultant. So that department should be able to help as well from that point of view. District nurses, probably, but district nursing services is changed a lot over the years, and what they do and what they don't do has changed an awful lot. So it's worth exploring, but may not be able to help.
Thank you. I've experience of popping them in in a whole manner of different places and locations, and it can definitely be done. And it's amazing how you can clean up and minimize the risk of infection as well. Like, it is very doable. It seems quite intimidating when you're doing those medical procedures on yourself the first few times. Certainly it does become easier and simpler doing that when you're building up that experience.
Yes, I do remember putting a catheter in the middle of a business class aircraft. That was entertaining.
Ed, wasn't it Niall that had to take his out
Yeah.
on the middle of an ice cap?
Yeah. To your point, Ollie, we did ice cap crossing. First, all disabled team crossing unsupported of Vatnajökull, which is the biggest ice cap in Europe. So it was 12 days across an ice cap with a guy called Niall McCann, who's an incomplete paraplegic, and a guy called Darren Edwards, who's a complete paraplegic, who's in a sit ski. There's actually a half-hour film that's going on the Kendal Tour this year, so it should be available online to watch. But it's quite interesting of like how to manage our own health conditions during this trip, and any one of us couldn't have made it, but together we could help each other because, you know, my hand stopped working, but even though Darren's complete, he's very strong and mobile in his upper body, so he could do things for me like laces and undoing stuff that I couldn't do in the tent. But then of course I can help him get his chair ready and things like that. So there was a collaboration. But Niall, for this trip, he uses intermittent catheters. The concern was because of the temperature on the ice cap, they would freeze because there's often liquid in the packet, as you know. So he got an indwelling put in. So he actually went to hospital, I think, and got it put in before we left. But then on day 6 or 7, he started experience retention. So it obviously clogged up with sediment on the inside, but he didn't have any experience of taking the catheter out. And I did have some experience from years before, because when I used to use them. So there's this scene on the ice cap of Niall sat there, and it's quite a serious situation, right? If you go into retention, if it backs up to your kidneys, that was trip over, that's helicopter evacuation, all of these sorts of things. The camera's quite close, but it's all blurred out. But, you know, he's trying to take the balloon down. I'm like, no, don't try and cough if you take it out. And it was struggling for about 5 minutes, and eventually it came out, and there's all of us celebrating on the middle of this ice cap because a natural wee is happening. It was a very bizarre situation, but yeah, I just thought it was quite a funny story that's relevant.
Brilliant story. And I think maybe some people feel that's a bit extreme or not necessarily relevant, but actually it really is, because I think it's that demonstration of this can happen anywhere, and actually solutions can be overcome. And I think sometimes in those situations, it's right, how do we actually solve the problem? And there is always a solution to be found. So important to building up that experience toolkit, right? And be able to kind of share experience and advice. Love that. I think I'm going to sign up for some of these adventures afterwards with you guys. I'm slightly jealous that I haven't been on any of these crazy trips. Love that. And I'm sure anyone else would be able to get in touch as well if they wanted to. So yeah, inspired to get involved. It sounds good fun. Another area that we've chatted a little bit about is, I suppose, getting on the plane, preparing equipment and wheelchairs and things like that. And I, being a full-time wheelchair user, have to be very conscious about handing that over. And I suppose there's that massive lack of control. But something I do that makes me feel better most of the time is I have an air tag that I just strap underneath my chair, and gives me that sense of reassurance that the chair is going with me. There was one time though, for whatever reason, the air tag hadn't updated itself, and on my phone it was saying it was in the airport that we had left, and I didn't think it was going to come out. But actually the wheelchair did make it. I ended up just feeling incredibly anxious the whole flight, thinking my wheelchair had been left behind, but actually it was there. So I think it's also important to kind of remember that maybe the information that you get from those things isn't always accurate as well. And what are you going to be able to do in that situation? Because when I thought my wheelchair had been left behind, I told the air stewardess, and they were, you know, we're not turning the plane around, right? It's just one of those unfortunate events. So it's that anxiety, managing what you're going to do with that information, I think is really, really important.
Just out of interest, if your wheelchair is left behind,
Yeah.
what does that look like at the other end? Do the airline provide you with, obviously it's not going to be your wheelchair, like, or do you just have to sit in the airport and wait, or how does that look?
Yeah, great question. So I've had it once before, and I was taken to the front of the plane just on the aisle chair, and then I was popped into an airport chair, and I had to use the airport wheelchair when I was away for about 2 days. And it was not a chair that, I suppose it wouldn't even be an Action 3 wheelchair. It was very heavy, really, really difficult to maneuver. I definitely had to have people helped support me around. I couldn't really push it very well. But the main thing was I had my pressure relieving cushion with me. So incredibly frustrating, and there isn't much you can do in that situation. But I think the one thing I will say is I've traveled a lot and it's only happened once. And I think very often we hear of all of these horror stories of people traveling and equipment not coming through. And those are because those are the stories that people are interested in, right? People are horrified by it, right? So it becomes that vortex and can really scare people away from traveling, when actually the majority of the time for people, they don't experience that. So I think, yes, it's important to know that it can happen. But then, I suppose it really depends on insurance that you have for your chair as well, because there is a bit of an unknown if it could get damaged when it does come back to you. So making sure you've got your kit insured and preparing your chair as much as possible so it's less likely to break. When I hand it over, for example, I'll always pop the brakes on really, really, really tightly and say there's no way that it can come off, so I don't want the wheels to be taken off. If there's anything that's a bit loose, duct tape, zip ties and things like that, just to hold everything together on the chair as tightly as possible. But Mark, I was going to come to you quickly because maybe you've got a bit of experience on power chairs and getting batteries ready, because that's a whole nother challenge.
Airlines aren't hugely keen on electric chairs, but they will carry them, no problem at all. Another thing about preparation is informing the airline early on as you can that you will be travelling with an electric wheelchair. They're usually happy with that, but they do want lots of details. They want exact details of the battery, what type it is, the size and the weight, and whether it will be disconnected or remain connected. They'll want the weight of the wheelchair, all the dimensions of the wheelchair, height, width, all those things. As long as you've got them in advance, they're usually pretty good.
Yeah, I will say they don't always have to be perfect as well. I give them a bit of a broad, vague description of the chair. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. They can make it work.
Yeah, sometimes they've come back to us with very specific questions about the chair, the make, the model, the exact dimensions. Some airlines can be very pedantic and want to know exactly and any extras that are attached to it.
My main bit of advice of traveling with a chair is don't get off the plane unless you can see your wheelchair, because it's very easy once you've got off the plane and popped into an airport chair. It's no longer the airline's responsibility to find your wheelchair. It falls to the airports, where if you remain on the plane, the airlines want to get that plane moving as quickly as possible. So they are going to have all of the incentive to find your chair. And it's amazing how quickly they can go from, no, you have to get off the plane, to you saying, no, I'm not moving, to all of a sudden everyone getting involved and they find your chair very quickly. That's my biggest tip. But it's having the confidence to know that you can say, I'm not getting off the plane until I see my chair. And unfortunately, they can make you feel like you are letting the side down and you really should get off the plane. So it's having that confidence and knowledge that you can ask to remain on the plane until your chair does arrive. Little tips like that I think are really, really helpful, because it's not very nice being sat in the corner of an airport waiting for a chair to somehow appear, and they always tend to be the last out of the baggage belt if they do come through. So I'm going to round up with a couple of questions, and I'm going to come to Lois first. Of what does travelling with confidence mean to you?
I think travelling with confidence, to me, that means being prepared and feeling calm. That's when we've had the most enjoyable holidays and the most amazing trips, is when we feel like we've controlled our controllables. However, we also have that knowledge that things might happen and there will be solutions. So having that confidence in the back of our minds of that we can find solutions because we've been prepared on all of the stuff that we can control. So that would be my answer.
Love that. Thanks, Lois. And Ed, what does travelling with confidence mean to you?
I agree with Lois that preparation is obviously very important, but often that preparation is built on lived experience and you've got the resources out there to plan ahead. But going back to a point you made earlier, I think we all have a negativity bias, and the way the news and media is set up, it makes it seem as if if you travel with a disability, you're going to be in for a world of trouble, because you hear the the bad news more than the good. And I've had very few examples. Of course, I've had examples of things not going right, but I had plenty of examples of travel not going right before I had a disability. So would encourage people to do it, to get out there, to do the research before. And of course, things might happen if you travel a lot, but it might happen anyway. And over time and through experience, you're going to reap so many more rewards from doing it than you are from not. And on the whole, it's a positive experience. Sometimes it's just having that perspective of like, realistically, what is the worst that can happen, and having a solution mindset as well, that you can overcome these things, caveated with the fact that obviously the better prepared you are, the easier you can overcome those issues. But just my message would be, get out there and do it at the end of the day, because you could spend your whole life planning to do it and not actually get on and do it. And sometimes you've just got to rip the band-aid off and have that first experience, realize it's not as scary as you think, and then you're often running or rolling or walking or whatever your situation is.
And remembering the incredible experiences that come with travel, right?
Yeah.
You get so much from ripping that band-aid off. It's so valuable. Mark, I'm going to come to you with the same question.
I did over 1,000 trips bringing people back. Probably at least 3/4 of them were on commercial airlines. And a bit like Lois, like, the more prepared you are, the airline's prepared, the less issues you're going to have, and be prepared for things going wrong and plan Bs. And sometimes not being too pedantic and working with the airports and the airlines, because they sometimes can be very rigid in their rules, and sometimes working with them rather than being too pedantic and bulking at their particular silly rules. If you can work with them, that sometimes smooths your passage.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all of your time. We really value your stories, your honesty and time that you've taken to talk to us today. I know everyone that's listening is going to have a lot to take away and a lot to think about, and hopefully is going to be inspired to take those trips. Thank you for listening to Access All Areas, SIA's Travel and Mobility podcast. If you'd like to find out more, click the link below, and don't forget to follow us on social media. This podcast is made possible by funding from the Motability Foundation.